This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek. And the struggle that we're going to talk about today is the relationship of the AFL-CIO and other unions to international work and what that's about. And we're joined with Kim Scipes, who is a professor and journalist and written extensively on the role of the AFL-CIO internationally. So welcome to WorkWeek, Kim.
Well, thank you, Steve. Good to be back with you.
Good. So, first of all, to introduce to our audience, you've focused for many years on the relationship of the AFL-CIO International Affairs Department, the Solidarity Center, and its operations internationally. Why don't you talk about how you got involved in that issue, and also why it's important for American working people?
My interest in this goes back to 1983. I was on my way to Germany to protest the deployment of the cruise and Pershing missiles. That was one of Reagan's fantasies. I'd been part of a protest in Central California, where 75 of us went on the base to delay the launch of the MX missile, and we delayed it for a week. And then afterwards, folks started talking about going to Germany, so I was going to Germany. But I was a working class kid. I'd never been to Europe. I thought, what the hell, I'll go over a little earlier. So I did. I went to England. This was 83. So Thatcher was in power, but she hadn't had her impact. So I traveled throughout the country and all of that. And I ended up stumbling on a conference in Manchester, which was the launching of a new international labor magazine called International Labor Reports. And one of the people that showed up there was a guy named Don Thompson. And Thompson had co-written a book with Rodney Larson called Where Were You, Brother? It was an account of trade union imperialism. And it was looking at the British unions in Africa and how they had fought against colonialism. But in his book, there's a fair amount of stuff on the AFL-CIO. And I read it and I was blown away. So over the years, I have both times directly and indirectly been paying attention to this, looking out for this. I wrote, I think, a quite path-breaking book in 2010 called AFL-CIO Secret War Against Developing Country Workers, Solidarity or Sabotage, which nobody has disputed. They've ignored it, so it won't get out. But it's out there and people know about it. So, in fact, before that happened, one of the big things was in 2005, I was working with a man named Fred Hirsch, who just recently died in December. Fred, very interesting cat. He was a plumber by trade. He had exposed the AFL-CIO's operation in Chile. They were involved in laying the groundwork for the Pinochet coup in 1973, and Fred had revealed this in 1974, got a resolution passed through the Santa Clara County Central Labor Council. Bill Doherty, the head of AFIELD, the Latin American regional organization, came to Santa Clara.
That was the American Institute of Free Labor Development.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, so Doherty came and tried to get the council to reverse that resolution, and Fred and his comrades were able to hold everything steady, and they sent Doherty packing. So Fred and I had worked together over the years, and in 2004, he with a bunch of other people in California worked together and got the California State AFL-CIO convention, which had over 400 delegates representing something like 2.5 million workers in California. They unanimously condemned the AFL-CIO's foreign policy. Now, this was transmitted to Washington, and that should have been brought forth as a resolution to the 2005 National Convention, which was being held in Chicago. Fred flew out, and he and I together worked to get that going. But the head of the resolutions committee, a man named Gerald McEntee, who was the head of the American AFSCME, American Federation
of State, County, and Municipal Employees.
Thank you. Yeah. McEntee was head of the resolutions committee, turned it around, made it instead of a resolution condemning it. And remember, it was unanimously condemned. Now, in California at that time was 1/6 of the entire AFL-CIO. So this was a major victory. And McEntee changed it from condemning the Solidarity Center and their foreign operations to one praising it. And that got passed. And they didn't even allow any discussion of the convention. It was terrible. So I figured at that time they weren't playing fair. I wrote my book and brought that out. In the meantime, I've been working with a number of scholars around the world who have been doing some investigations, and things are coming out, and we're learning about this, and I'm staying up on it. But I think it's really important for American workers, because I don't think American workers can solve the problems of the United States by themselves. I think that the struggle is a global one, and the only way that we have a chance of taking on these multinational corporations is by coming together on a global scale against them. And so that means building global labor solidarity. And you cannot support what I call the U.S. empire and support workers. They're contradictory. They're opposed to each other. And so I think this is an issue that the U.S. labor movement has to decide. It's, the classic question, which side are you on? Because what they've been doing is they've been supporting the ruling elites in this country and others against workers. It's documented. I'm not speculating at all. I know what they've done in a lot of countries, including my own field research in the Philippines, which I've done over many years. I know firsthand what they've done in a lot of countries. And they have helped support, in many cases, have supported efforts to overthrow democratically elected governments. They've supported dictators and things like this. All of this comes at the direct expense, I think, of American workers. And so I think American workers have to choose whether they want to join with other workers around the world, or whether they want to let the AFL-CIO operate on its own against other workers. Obviously, if American workers stay quiescent, the AFL-CIO leaders do what they want, and that's sabotaging any type of global labor solidarity.
And we're speaking with Kim Scipes, who's a professor who's been writing about the role of the AFL-CIO and U.S. labor internationally for many years. Now, Kim, why don't you go over the organizations that the AFL-CIO operates through internationally and how they're funded? Because as we know, there was a scandal over the CIA direct funding of the AFL-CIO international operations, and they had to change the way it was funded.
Well, it's a more complex thing than that, Steve. Is the AFL-CIO, back when it was still the AFL, before the merger in 1955, was getting direct funding from the CIA. That's been established. I mean, again, I'm not speculating, but about 1958, that funding ended. But in '61, when John Kennedy became president, they established USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, and they started using that to fund the AFL-CIO's operations around the world. And the AFL set up 3 regional organizations: AFIEL, the American Institute for Free Labor Development in Latin America. They had the AALC, African American Labor Center in Africa, and they had AFLI, the Asian American Free Labor Institute in Asia. Okay, so these 3 regional operations basically were on their own, and they were doing bad things everywhere. They were supporting, like I said, they helped overthrow the government, the democratically elected government in Brazil in '64. And this, by the way, was after the AFL had overthrown the democratically elected government in Guatemala in 1954. But then the merger in '55, so subsequent is all AFL-CIO. So they overthrew the democratically elected government in Brazil in '64. They overthrew the democratically elected government in Chile in 1973. They supported various dictators such as Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. They supported who was that guy in the Congo who was
Lumumba, Lumumba,
no,
Lumumba.
no, no, not no. That's Lumumba was a freedom fighter. There was the head of the army that took over after they killed Lumumba. Um,
Mobuto.
Mabuto. There you go. Thank you.
Mobuto.
Yeah, CC Mabuto. Anyway, the AFL-CIO supported them. They supported the white unions in South Africa. They were doing terrible things around the world. Now, activists within the labor movement had raised a lot of cane over this. And one of the factors that led to John Sweeney being elected president in 1995 in the first Democratic election for the presidency of the AFL-CIO was he promised to do away with the regional organizations. And to his credit, he did do that. But in 1997, he started a thing that had the grandiose name of ACILS, the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, which initially was sort of replaced by the Solidarity Center informally. Now the name's been changed to just the Solidarity Center. They have operations in 60 countries around the world. There is some evidence that in a few places they are doing positive or at least not bad things, but there's a lot we don't know about them. They have never, ever given an honest report about what they're doing, why they're in these countries, what their purpose is. And the thing is that roughly 90% or more of their funding comes from the US government. Now, so the irony of this is that one of the justifications for the regional organizations was that they were to counteract the evil communists. And the evil communists were getting money from their governments. They weren't telling their people, and they were operating around the world. That's exactly what the AFL-CIO was doing. Behind the backs, they've never given an honest report about what they're doing. They've never told us what's going on. They don't talk about their funding. The funding is totally uncontrolled by the union, by any union processes. It all comes directly from the U.S. government. It's laundered through the National Endowment for Democracy, which is one of the biggest lies that has ever been perpetrated on the world. They are not interested in any kind of democracy in the sense that you and I know about it. And the AFL is one of four major institutes, as they call them, of the National Endowment for Democracy, which basically is the spear tip of the so-called soft power of the U.S. empire going around the world. And John Sweeney, see, this was the National Endowment for Democracy was created in 1983. The claim is that it's an independent agency, which is a lie from A to Z. It was funded by the US government to be studied. It was passed by both houses of Congress and signed from that notorious Democrat, that wonderful Democrat, Ronald Reagan. I'm being very sarcastic there, obviously. And it's a US government operation, but they set it up. It's really interesting is that they've got it set up so it's insulated from any type of US government control. So if an administration came in and wanted to do away with it, they can't. It's set up as a semi-autonomous operation. It's completely funded by Congress every year. They do what they want. They don't report. And this is one thing that those of us in the labor movement who know about it have been trying to bring to people's attentions for years. And most people in the labor movement don't want to even address this stuff.
And one of the issues about the policy of this Solidarity Center and National Endowment for Democracy is they were quite active in pushing for privatization in Russia, Ukraine. AFL-CIO supported union officials in these countries were supporting privatization, working with the billionaires to privatize the economy to support really a rising oligarchy. The policies of the United States following the IMF and World Bank are deregulation, privatization. Why is the AFL-CIO's international operations really supporting unions that support those policies?
Well, see, I look at it a little different than that, Steve. In other words, I think the concept that you've got to address, and I don't think we on the left have done this so very well, is that the U.S. foreign policy since at least 1945, and we can argue it goes back further, but at least from 45, the purpose of the U.S. foreign policy has been to dominate the countries of the world. And I call that the U.S. empire. It's obviously, no, it's not a territorial based empire such as the Romans, who conquered all this land. The U.S. has been more sophisticated on this. They've captured the political and economic processes of a lot of countries. And so they're able to control a lot of the world through that way. They use the IMF and the World Bank. Those are not independent organizations. Those are organizations that support the empire, just as the World Trade Organization does. They've got it set up because basically they don't want, ideally, they don't want to have to send the troops in or someplace like that. Because as they learned in Vietnam, sometimes that can go totally haywire. And that was one of the reasons the U.S. got defeated in Vietnam, was the U.S. military was torn apart and refused to fight. And I know because I was a veteran in the Marine Corps during that time and was in part of this stuff, minor part, but I was there, I saw it on the ground, and I know about it. They don't want that. They'd rather find obscure bureaucratic processes that nobody can figure out, and they will use them. The National Endowment for Democracy is the primary one for this. They've been trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela ever since 2002. The AFL-CIO was indirectly involved in that coup attempt to overthrow Hugo Chavez, which fortunately failed. And then in 2006, by the way, I went to Venezuela to try to understand what was going on there. And Chavez's government was not a dictatorship. I had been in the Philippines in January 1986 under Marcos, and I knew the difference. And Venezuela was nothing like this, although the U.S. government and certainly the New York Times keeps bleeding that it is a dictatorship, but that's garbage. But anyway, so the U.S. is trying to one, control the world, and two, they want everybody to do what they say. So that's why, for example, we're pissed at Cuba. We've been at war with Cuba since at least 1962. Now, think about this. Cuba's a small country. They got a population about the size of New York City. Why is the U.S. blockading them? A blockade that continues today and has hurt the Cubans in getting medicine to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. Or why are they trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela, which they're still trying to do? In fact, the NED got busted for funding a rock and roll band to play propaganda in their concerts and stuff a couple of years ago. But this idea that the U.S. knows what everybody else should be doing is nonsense. Now, the truth of the matter, and most trade unions in our country don't want to address this, and I include this among some prominent radicals in the movement that know about this. They don't want to confront this idea that the AFL-CIO is basically thinking that the U.S. should run the world. They support the U.S. empire. All right, and I'm not speculating. This is all drawn out in my book and heavily detailed. I'm not speculating.
Well, why are these radicals, or so-called radicals in the labor movement? Maybe you can talk about them. Why do they think that you should not challenge the fact that their unions or our unions are actually supporting U.S. imperialism, are supporting the suppression of workers and independent unions around the world?
I don't know. I can't figure it out. People will not talk to me about this. They will not engage. They will not bring this stuff up. And that's why when I saw this piece, when John Sweeney died, there were a number of pieces that were, there was a lot of stuff going out. I know it was, on the email stuff. There was a bunch of stuff within the Democratic Socialists of America. We were seeing this stuff. It was all largely kissy face stuff from Sweeney. Now, I'll admit, John Sweeney was not a Lane Kirkland. He wasn't a George Meany. I mean, who were total fascists as far as I'm concerned. I'll give Sweeney a little doubt on that. But anyway, excuse me. You know, Sweeney did a lot of things. Like I say, Sweeney supported National Endowment for Democracy, and he supported the Solidarity Center with that, and that needed to be called out. He also needed to be called out for that situation in Chicago that I talked about earlier, where the California resolution, which was unanimously passed, was changed from condemning the Solidarity Center's actions to one praising it. Sweeney was responsible for that. That happened on his watch. So, you know, and they also were working with the Bush administration. I can't remember the name of the program offhand. It's in the article, but they were doing all this, and this stuff never got mentioned. See, and I've never seen, I may be wrong. I don't think I am, but I've never seen anybody within the labor movement take on the National Endowment for Democracy, except, you know, a few individuals here or there. But some of the more prominent people who are well known, known as leftists and or radicals or whatever like that, they have left that issue alone, and I can't understand why.
And, you know, Bill Fletcher was one of them in his review of John Sweeney. Of course, he worked as a education director of John Sweeney, and the education department has been shut down by the AFL-CIO. But one of the issues that should be raised, I think, is should the AFL-CIO be getting U.S. government money for international operations? You think
yeah, you know, you're absolutely right. They shouldn't, or let's put it this way. If they're going to take the money from the feds, they need to come to the members and say, this is what we're asking for. This is why, this is da, 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 and lay it out and detail it. They have never, ever, ever done that. You know, for some reason, most Americans, in my experience, seem to think we shouldn't be doing this shit. We shouldn't be overthrowing democratically elected government. We shouldn't be supporting dictators. Duh. I mean, come on, give me a break. But the AFL-CIO doesn't want that publicized. They won't touch it. You know, they won't. I mean, like I say, the Solidarity Center is operating in the latest number I've heard is 60 countries, which has been for a while. Nobody knows which countries. Nobody knows what they're doing. You know, it's utterly insane. Here's the other problem, though. I mean, it's. I mean, we can sort of discuss it as, oh, good feelings or moral to support workers around the world, but there's another reason. I mean, I may be wrong, but I can't think of a single fight that the AFL-CIO has led since at least 1980 that has won something from the workers. I mean, if you think of any of the struggles, the largest one I can think of is the Teamster struggle in 97, I think it was. AFL-CIO didn't do anything about that. That was the Teamsters that fought that. The AFL-CIO has done nothing about this. Their only thing is try to get Democrats elected. They got Bill Clinton elected. And by the way, in today's New York Times, Charles Blow really tears Clinton up and says Clinton's even admitted his administration was a failure. Well, that came from the AFL-CIO. In 2004, there was a man named Frank Imspack, a longtime respected labor leader, that was trying to get a project called WINS, Workers Independent News, established, and it was a pro-labor operation. Frank has deep roots in the labor movement, and he finally got an appointment with the political director of the AFL-CIO. And at that time I was out of work. Frank picked me up, and I was doing some work with him. So he says, "Why don't you come to DC with me?" I said, "Great." So I went with him, sat in on the meeting, and then the AFL-CIO, in a year that they gave $55 million to John Kerry, they gave Frank, I think, $5,000. You know, it was ludicrous. He wanted to help build out labor communications infrastructure, which you've long been working with, as well as other labor educators around the country. No, getting some damn Democrat who's pretty useless elected was much more important, and you can see by the scope of the money. So the AFL-CIO, basically all they've done is they put forth these candidates for president. They haven't even won all of them. The ones that have won haven't done crap. Biden's the first one to even do anything along those lines in a serious manner. We'll see how he turns out. His foreign policy looks terrible already, although his domestic policy stuff, thank goodness, is much better than Bush. But he's not going to solve our problems. And he's not going to bring manufacturing back, which is a great white hope of the AFL-CIO. The corporate management shifted billions and billions of dollars of investment overseas. Labor-intensive jobs went to countries like Mexico and then later China and Vietnam and stuff like that. They sent this money overseas. You had Trump promise to bring it back. Even if they wanted to bring manufacturing back, even if they wanted to move the production back, it would all be replaced by computers and robots. There's never going to be the widespread manufacturing employment in this country that we once had. And, the AFL-CIO one doesn't want to deal with that. They're off in this fantasy land. The other thing is they're not talking about climate change and environmental destruction, which threatens the existence of the humans, plants, and humans, animals, and most plants by the turn of the century. I mean, we could see the beginning of extermination of humanity by that time if we don't do something very seriously and quickly. I don't see the AFL-CIO doing anything on that. They're not even talking about this stuff. And then that raises even another issue. Actually raises two issues. One, what have they done for American workers? And I don't think they've done squat for American workers. Maybe individual unions have, and there have been some fights, and that's been good. But in general, the AFL-CIO hasn't. And then comes the larger question. And let's say they're at best neutral for American workers, and that's about all I'll give them. Are they the force that is going to revive a labor movement in this country? In other words, can the AFL-CIO meet the needs of workers today? I've seen no evidence of that. You see these independent efforts, you see things like warehouse workers for justice and stuff like this, different operations around the country. Are they getting help from the AFL-CIO? No, because the AFL-CIO doesn't want to mobilize them.
Yeah, a prime example of that right now is this whole effort to organize in Amazon, Bessemer, Alabama. And the fact that the AFL-CIO is, if you looked at their front page, the last time I looked, no mention of the Amazon fight. The Southern Workers Assembly has organized protests all over the country. There's an International Day of Protests on March the 20th around the country. AFL-CIO is refusing to involve all the labor councils in mobilizing for the Amazon workers to make it a national issue. It seems like they're more interested in, legislation or the Democrats doing something for them than mobilizing workers independently. So the other thing is when you've mentioned about the role of the Solidarity Center, there was a wildcat of 70,000 workers near El Paso, and no mention of the AFL-CIO, no mobilization to support the workers in Mexico who were on strike against, not only against the slave wages conditions, Matamoros, of these parts companies, but also the fact that there are company unions there that the government supports, and U.S. multinationals, GM and other companies basically have company unions. And the AFL-CIO is not making that a national issue. In fact, this recent USMCA bill, which Richard Trumka supported, supports the continued deregulation, colonization of Mexico, and has not really changed anything as far as workers in Mexico, their independence.
Yeah. No, and just in today's New York Times, which I do read, although critically to say the least, there's a big story about all these people that are coming up to the US border from Mexico and further south, and they're wanting to come in the US. And nobody's asking why they're coming here. And the fact is that the US has not encouraged economic development south of the US border to meet the needs of those people. And when they've tried, such as in Cuba or Venezuela, we've done everything we can to undermine them, including throughout the rest of Latin America. And so the chickens are sort of coming home to roost. And they've got a problem, a big problem.
Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, was involved in an overthrow of a government in Honduras as Secretary of State.
Yep, in 2009.
What happened there?
Well, I mean, you had a democratically elected government, and the military decided they were going to get rid of him, and the U.S. accepted it. They didn't shut it down. They had the power. I mean, you know, we're funding these militaries. Now, why are we funding them? That's another question nobody wants to ask. But it's to make the world safe for capitalist corporations to be able to migrate there, because they can make third world, great profits off third world labor. And then they send their products back to the US and profit off us as well. Capitalism cannot, for all this free market rhetoric and bullshit about the free market can determine everything, blah blah blah. The free market, one, is a myth, and two, capitalism cannot survive, much less thrive, without extensive support from the state. That meaning governments of both the Democrats and the Republicans in our country and every other country. I mean, one of the myths, like right now in our country, under Trump, the economy did really, really well. I mean, the stock market's gone up. Everybody's going hoo-yah, hoo-yah, all that, but we have to ask, where did the stock market get its money? The economy has not been doing much. Well, if you start looking at the U.S. national debt, you'll see what's going on. So let me explain for a minute. The U.S. every year, the U.S. government has a budget, as we all know, and at the end of the year, they have a surplus or deficit. And they add those together, and it's been cumulative since 1789, since the founding of the country. So from 1789 under George Washington to 1980 under Jimmy Carter, the U.S. national debt was less than $1 trillion. It was $907 billion. Okay, now this covered the War of 1812. It covered the Civil War. It covered the war against the Native Americans out on the plains. It covered the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. It covered the electrification of the Tennessee Valley Authority. It included the space program and the interstate highway program. Less than $1 trillion. 192 years, less than $1 trillion. Ronald Reagan gets in and in 8 years doubles the national debt, because he goes spending crazy on the military to protect the empire. Since then, since 1980, our national debt has grown from under $1 trillion to where we're over $23 trillion in debt. So basically, our economy, which has not been doing well, has nonetheless been doing as well as it has, because the US government's been writing hot checks. There's nothing behind it. Now, as long as we're this economic powerhouse, we can get away with it. I mean, the bankers of the world, all the central bankers know about this crap. This is not secret. But one of the problems is that when U.S. corporations tried to take advantage of China and shifted all this production to China, the Chinese actually did a very smart thing, and they utilized that money to advance the well-being of the people of their society. They modernized their military, blah, 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 but they built an economic powerhouse. And they can now ship a boxcar of cargo from China to Spain in 8 days, a railroad. It takes 33 days for a ship to make the same trip. All right, so China has built up. At some point in time, China is undoubtedly going to demand that the dollar no longer be a singular world currency, that there's a basket full of currencies, including the yuan, the Chinese currency. And at that point in time, the U.S. The game's over for the U.S. because we can no longer manipulate the monetary system like we will.
And but
That's
the AFL-CIO, this is pretty interesting, has always supported the military budget. They've never, in fact, the teachers union, the AFSCME, SEIU, these national unions have not opposed military spending, despite the fact that the military spending in the United States is coming out of social services, education, public services.
absolutely.
This pro-imperialist ideology of the trade union leadership of the AFL-CIO and these national unions, do you think that that's part of their idea that they should support U.S. economic interests, imperial interests around the world?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. Unfortunately, it's not limited to just the trade union leadership. I think that's the way a lot of us have been educated in this country. So we don't even think about this or question it. And a lot of workers accept this stuff. I mean, look at how many people are going into the military and have gone. And I say that as somebody who did it myself. You know, I went in the Marine Corps in 1969 at age 17. You know, I beat the draft. I volunteered. I was totally stupid at that time. I learned from my experiences, but I could have very easily gotten killed through them. For what reason? For what reason? See, here's the thing. They say we got to have this big military because we're under threat. Who's going to invade us? Nobody is. I mean, when you look at the biggest invasion in the history of warfare was the invasion of Europe from England. All right, 1944. It was a 20-mile stretch of water, and the damn invasion almost failed. Okay. Now you're telling me the Chinese are going to come over thousands of miles of ocean and invade us and come to a country where we got more guns than we got people and we're crazy as hell? No Chinese leader is that stupid. The Canadian, I'm not worried about Canada with their 20 million people. I'm not even worried about Mexico with theirs. It's total nonsense. And once you look at it, once you take that Yankee Doodle dandy shit off your, around that's been wrapped around your face, and you look at, you see this is a lie. And your point is absolutely correct. Money that goes in the military cannot go for education. It can't go for healthcare. It can't go for infrastructure. It can't go for mitigating climate change or any of the other problems. It can't address. We have the greatest economic inequality of any of the developed countries in the world. It can't do that because we're off giving it to these military pigs like Raytheon and Boeing and stuff like that. It's not going to the troops even. It's going to these big defense contractors that hire generals when they retire and pay them lots of money to lobby their former bosses.
And of course, I mean, the escalation of trade war by the United States, both Trump and now Biden saying that we have to encircle China, we have to encircle Russia, and we have to support sanctions on countries all around the world. I mean, that seems to be the reigning position of both the Democrats and Republicans, supported by the trade union AFL-CIO leadership. There's no apparent opposition nationally to the AFL-CIO leadership position, that we have to go against China, go against Russia. We have to have sanctions. We have to basically try to put our power against the people of the world if we don't agree with what they're doing.
And where you're seeing that's failing. That's the other thing that's interesting. Europe used to line up lockstep behind us. Europe is no longer doing that. And part of the reason is, like I say, China can put cargo in Europe in 8 days via railroad. And what's really interesting on that, if you look at a geostrategic position, they've just taken the U.S. Navy out of the equation. The Navy cannot stop this rail traffic. It's just insane, even with their aircraft carriers. It's just totally ludicrous. But Americans go, yeah, we got to defeat the Chinese, we got to defeat the Russians because they're evil. Yeah, well, I'll tell you something else. One of the big myths that we were told is that the Russians created the Cold War. I've been doing some research on this, and I disagree. It was started by the U.S. and the United Kingdom working together against the Soviets. After World War II, the Soviet Union wanted to work with the United States, and especially our labor movement. And labor leaders like Philip Murray and Walter Reuther sabotaged that, and I can prove it. You know,
Well,
so
they don't see the need to link up with workers around the world against the same multinationals. You would think that workers now fighting Amazon, workers in this country should link up with workers around the world, have an international day of action against Amazon, against other union busters, Walmart. I mean, on a global level, but that doesn't seem to be the perspective of the AFL-CIO. Their Solidarity Center is not organizing and supporting real international solidarity, linking up American workers with workers fighting the same multinationals overseas, which
no,
would seem to be solidarity. I mean,
well, the
that would,
thing is, at best, they will support a certain struggle or whatever. And there's some cases where they've done that they've not screwed it up. They've gone in, they've given some help, they've given some training, stuff like this. So they're not all evil like Afl and Afl-Cio and ALC were. But no, in none of those cases has there been any sustained effort to try to link up with American workers to build that international solidarity. I know of no case of that. I've heard nothing. I haven't even heard of rumors of that. It's absolutely insane, and like I say, with 90% of the money coming from the United States government, why would we expect that to happen? As they say, those that pay the piper pays the tune, plays the tune. Truth hurts, but it's there.
and one issue as well that has come up in as far as the international policy, the AFL-CIO, is support for Israel and support for a Jewish state, opposition to the conditions of that Israel has on the Palestinians. It seems like it's policy of the AFL-CIO to support the idea of Jewish states, although they don't support religious states here. They're supporting them in Israel and in defense of what they're doing there.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a struggle. There's no question they're supporting Israel, and they're supporting, ironically, it's the Democrats that are much closer to Israel traditionally than the Republicans. Donald Trump was an aberration on that. But George Bush, for example, the old man, was really trying to put some limits on what Israel was doing and stuff like that, because Israel was acting insane. And their oppression of the Palestinians is condemned around the world. People want that to end. And the AFL-CIO has never taken any lead to do that. They're fine with that.
Sweeney personally prevented, while he was president of the SEIU, a resolution coming up nationally in the SEIU that would oppose the subjugation of the Palestinians. He said that the AFL-CIO couldn't take a position, or the SEIU couldn't take a position on that as long as the Jewish Labor Committee did not support it.
Yeah, well, I don't know that particular thing. I mean, I take your word for it. It sounds very logical, but no. See, it keeps coming back, Steve. To in my opinion, the question is, who are they serving? Are they serving American workers and our interests, or are we serving the interests of the empire? And I think what you've seen, if you look at the history the way I have, what you see, and by the way, this goes long before the so-called communist threat. The AFL-CIO's reactionary foreign policy started at the end of the 1800s, very early 1900s at the latest, and this was long before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This stuff
we were bringing democracy to Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, the Philippines, and these countries. I mean, that's, in fact, Mark Twain had an anti-imperialist league who was opposing it, but we invaded these countries, Puerto Rico, to bring democracy. In reality, we were bringing U.S. multinationals to exploit them. And in the case of Puerto Rico, actually, Samuel Gompers went there He was head of the AFL because he was concerned that the Puerto Rican workers would lower the wages of American workers. But he supported as well the occupation of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and also he supported although he was a had been recruited for the Anti-Imperialist League, is that after about 1898, he didn't even make a declaration around the war. This was a war. Most Americans don't know this because we only learn about the glorious charge of Teddy Roosevelt up San Juan Hill and all that crap. But the U.S. had a war in the Philippines. We killed between 500,000 and 1 million Filipinos, men, women, and children. That was between 10 and 20% of the entire population. It was a very, very brutal, vicious war. Mark Twain, to his credit, was one of the leaders against that, and
that's where waterboarding actually was developed in the Philippines.
Waterboarding, yeah, absolutely. Waterboarding, all kinds of torture, poisoning wells, free fire zones, all that stuff that we learned about in Vietnam, it actually happened around the turn of the century in the Philippines before. But we've never been told that. I always wonder why we don't get told these things. It's crazy question.
Well, do you think it should be the responsibility of the unions as far as education to educate American workers about the role of U.S. imperialism in many countries, Philippines, Puerto Rico, all over the world?
I would think so, but Steve, most of the unions don't even educate their members about their own union's history. I mean, I live in Northwest Indiana. We've got I believe the last 4 integrated steel mills in existence in this country are between Chicago and Northwest Indiana. Okay. And I teach a course on race and ethnic diversity, and in it, I have the students read a wonderful book called Black Freedom Fighters in Steel. And it tells it's interviews with these 5 African-American men over time. It was written by Ruth Needleman, who's now retired, professor, and did a wonderful job. And in it, it talks about building the Steelworkers Union and yet having to fight white members over racial exclusion and things like that. The discrimination inside the union. And one of my students was in the class. She took the class, she finished, and she decided she was going to go get a job in the steel mill. And she did, and she got hired. She was a laborer. And she came back to me one day. She found me in the hallway. She says, "Dr. Scipes," she says, "I know more about that friggin' union, about the history of that union than any other member out there because they don't educate their members." Give me a break.
Well, maybe they're afraid that if their members were educated, the bureaucracy would be thrown out. You would have more of a rank and file controlled union. Is that their concern?
Well, I think that's part of it, but the steelworkers see, and that's a long story, but the steelworkers has always been a top-down union, and
but haven't in the post-war period, even before, well, the AFL was itself top-down craft union, but isn't the structure of the American unions and the AFL-CIO corporate structured? There's no real democracy. In most unions, you can't elect your national leader. There's a debate going on now with the Vermont AFL-CIO, which said that after a discussion and debate in their membership, said that there should be a general strike if there was an attempted coup. There is no real discussion and debate within the labor movement broadly about the issues that working people face in this country. It seems like it's organized to prevent that, actually, despite the technology, social media, that would allow a lot of unions to have national debates and discussions on their history, on the issues facing them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think, the unions were necessarily set up that way. Some were, but there were other unions that were tremendously democratic and run by the rank and file membership. And the Meat Packers Union, the United Packing House Workers of America, the Packing House Workers of America, incredibly democratic union. But in 1949, the AFL, or the CIO, I'm sorry, this was in the CIO, this under Phil Murray and driven by Walter Reuther, they drove out 11 of the most progressive unions out of the labor movement. We lost somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million workers. They didn't run the packing house workers were not thrown out. They were the only left-led union that wasn't, but they threw out all these work. The labor movement has never recovered from that day. Since that time, the unions that have survived have been basically top-down unions controlled by their leadership, do not want to mobilize their members. There's no rank and file democracy, or very limited. If there is, actually, one of the places where you can see probably the most democracy is in the building trades. Unfortunately, much of the building trades, much of their stuff has been racist and designed to keep blacks, Latinos, as well as women out of the building trades. But that's been a place where there's been a certain amount of democracy.
Well, but the mergers and the carpenters, many of these unions have had elections, but they've been merged and they've taken away local control. And during the Standing Rock struggle of the pipeline, at the same time that the building trades leadership were supporting that pipeline, they would kept their mouths shut about the fact that Trump was launching a racist attack on blacks, on Latinos, a xenophobic attack on immigrants. These building trades, including Trump, never challenged Trump about his really murderous attacks on immigrants in this country and blacks and Latinos. They were completely silent. No stand-up union official said to Trump, "We're taking you on. We're going to fight you."
Yeah.
You would think that would be, especially the building trades, where you have a large number of Latino and black workers in the building trades, silenced by the union leadership against Trump.
Yeah. Well, like I say, this raises questions of what, who they're serving. I'm not seeing very much, especially at the national level, of serving American workers. And, to me, that raises questions about, do we need to create a new labor center in this country? I mean, the Afl-Cio is what we call a labor center in international terminology. And some countries have one, like the US, Australia, the UK, Germany. Others like France, Sweden, the Philippines, India, they have multiple labor centers. And we've only had one here traditionally, that being the Afl-Cio since the merger. And
isn't that structured by the capitalist class here in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans? I mean, they require an agency shop. You can't vote for different unions, and the structure is that very undemocratic as far as real debate and discussion with as far as unions. And a lot of members of unions don't even know they're in a union in some cases.
Well, that's true, and you're right. It is structured, but I don't think it's structured by the capitalists. And at very least, even if the capitalists wanted it, the unions could fight it. But the unions have never fought it in this country.
So isn't that because it benefits them to have control of the rank and file? It's very difficult for workers to leave their union and to get another union. I mean, the structure of the National Labor Relations Board is very rigid as far as workers having other representation. They argued that, well, we don't want to have, I mean, the people said, well, we don't want to have a bunch of unions because then you would have company unions on the one hand. On the other hand, workers who want another representation, a union, have to fight the entire bureaucracy to get that in a union. And that bureaucracy organizes against them with the bosses in many, many cases.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. But but what I'm saying is that, it's, if the unions wanted democracy, they could fight for it. I haven't seen that. And I think you're right. I don't think the leaders want democracy because they want control. And you can certainly see it in most of the unions. There's some exceptions, and there's certainly,
well, the ILWU, the United Electrical Workers, which were the two survivors really, left unions who survived the witch hunt, and those unions used to be much larger, particularly the UE, but they were basically wiped out with this anti-communist witch hunt that took place.
Yeah.
Organized by the bosses, the government, and the union officials who wanted the leftists out of their unions.
Oh, Walter Reuther is particularly guilty of that. He waged a war against the UE and the entire left since 1939. And, again, I'm not speculating on this. I know what I'm talking about. And, Reuther Ruther really went after UE. He hated UE because they had a type of democracy, and once Ruther got into power, there really has been a little democracy within the UAW, especially on a
There's an
national level.
opposition grouping now. Well, do you think that this crisis of American labor movement, because of a decline of U.S. imperialism, because of the outsourcing, deregulation, the attack on American workers, will lead to a political development in the American working class?
Well, I don't know. Um, I mean, one of the things, first of all, I don't think we're ever going to see employment and the power of industrial unions the way that we had. The idea of going back to the 30s and 40s ain't never going to happen, period. I am certain on that. Now, however, as we know, there are many different industries that with workers in many different ways. If American workers started to organize in their workplaces, and we've seen a certain amount of that within teachers unions over the last few years. I actually was pretty involved with and did some work with a group that played a key role in creating CORE in the Chicago Teachers Union. But you see it through teachers and some of the mobilizations there that are exciting. Certainly healthcare is an area that's just screaming for unionization. The National Nurses Union is doing some things on that.
And
I think
they are growing now. The nurses are winning contracts in the South, in Alabama. I mean, that's probably one of the fastest growing unions in the country now, the National Nurses Union. But when you were talking about the big bubble in this country, the $14 trillion bubble in the United States, that's not going to go on forever. And the likelihood is it is going to, there'll probably going to be another economic decline bigger than 2008 in the economy, which could lead to mass mobilizations. And I wouldn't put out a thought that the idea of a general strike taking place in this country because of the depth of the economic crisis, which is likely to happen because of this expansion of credit.
Well, you know, I'm not a proponent of the general strike, and I'll tell you why. Because it's damned hard, even if you could pull it off, to sustain it for more than a week. And quite frankly, the capitalists are much more organized than that, and they could withstand that. But we're a long ways from creating a general strike. Hell, we can't even get we can't even get democracy in our own local unions. And I mean, this has got to change. But that's going to be up to American workers. Outsiders aren't going to convince workers to make those changes. You've been in unions for hell all your adult life, as far as I know, or most of it. I have as well. If unions are to change, or if workers are to change unions into democratic organizations and can fight for people, that's going to depend on the workers themselves deciding to do it.
Well, that's always the case in working class history. It's the workers themselves.
Absolutely.
Self-organization, and workers have to do it themselves. Nobody's going to save workers. They have to organize and themselves to defend themselves. So.
I totally agree with that, Steve. I totally agree with that. And that's why, for example, as you know, I've been going out to the Philippines since 1986. I've been studying this labor center called the Kilusung Mayo Uno, or it translates to May 1st movement. Now, most people don't even know there's a labor movement in the Philippines, but I'd argue that the KMU is one of the most developed, if not the most developed, trade union organization in the world. And I'm trying to learn from them. Excuse me. And I do a lot of writing about them. I just brought out a book called Building Global Labor Solidarity, Lessons from the Philippines, South Africa, Northwestern Europe, and the United States, trying to learn from these different struggles, see what we could learn from them. And that's one of the things that we have to do. So, when you talk about building global labor solidarity, it's more than just linking up and supporting each other in particular battles, although we certainly should do that whenever possible. But it's also learning from other countries, learning that we don't have all this knowledge, that we're not the smartest boys and girls on the block, but that we can learn from others, and we should look for successful cases.
And of course, the United States doesn't have a labor party, a workers' party run by workers. Basically, the unions give our money to the Democrats, and then the Democrats, in most cases, screw the workers after making a lot of promises. And we'll see what happens with Biden. But this failure of the working class to have their own political party is a real problem of having political representation. And what
Yeah,
happened to Bernie is a good example of that. Bernie Sanders, where the top national leadership actually conspired with the bosses and the Democrats to prevent Bernie from winning the primary.
yeah, no, you're right there. I mean, this goes back to about 1908 when Sam Gomper said, "No, we're not going to do that." It's certainly, you look at the countries in Europe where they have labor parties or social democratic parties, they're in much better shape. They don't have near the income inequality. They've got social services far above what we have. They're not trying to conquer the world. Um, a lot of there's a lot of things that we could learn from. But most Americans buy this propaganda that we're this shining light on the hill and everybody wants to become an American, all this crap, which is utter and complete nonsense. And that, but we've filled our heads with this nationalist ideology that's been laid on us in schools and propagated through the media today. And it's nonsense. And as long as people accept that, if they don't challenge that, it's not going to change. And it gets back to your point that workers, anytime workers have changed, have done anything for themselves, is because they've done it. The Democrats or non-governmental organizations or whoever, it's not going to do it, not going to save workers. Workers have to decide when their interests are at stake that they need to get off their asses. And there's all kinds of reasons why they don't. I understand that. God knows I've been beating my head for years against this brick wall. But that's what it's coming down to. Now, I'll tell you an area where I think where we're going to see some big crisis, and perhaps even before this economic crisis, and that's with climate change and environmental destruction. This stuff is happening. I mean, I teach a course on this. I have been since 2006. And I don't do direct research on the environment, but I teach about it. I'm up on what's being written about. And from the best science that I can see says that if we don't make drastic changes by 2030, we're going to see the beginning of the extermination of humans, animals, and most plants by the turn of this century. That's, maybe not my kids, but certainly their kids or their generation's kids, things like that. That's out there. And eventually people are going to say, all these wildfires in California burn up half the state. All these hurricanes that are destroying the Gulf Coast. All these hurricanes like Hurricane Sandy that really hammered New York City. Maybe there's some reason. Maybe we need to pull our heads out of our rear ends and look at this and stop buying into the propaganda. Stop listening to the nonsense. Stop caring about Kim Kardashian or the damn royals of England. All this nonsense that's, and look at our lives. Are our lives satisfactory? Are there good people? I live in the state of Indiana. You know what our minimum wage is, Steve? It's $7.25 friggin' hour. $7.25. Yet you cross the line. I mean, the difference between Indiana and Illinois on the northern part, it's nothing more than a line drawn down the middle of the street and then, on a map. It's not even there in real life, right? You go to Chicago and the minimum wage is $13 an hour. You cross the line, it's $7.25. And I look at, my students and say, are you guys worth that much less than people in Chicago? And they say, but the cost of living is so much cheaper. And then I go crazy because I lived in Chicago for 24 years. I know the differences. And other than cars, tobacco, and gas, and housing, there's almost no difference. You pay the same at McDonald's. You pay the same for movies. You buy at national products and stuff like that. That's something like $7, I forget the math, some seven something an hour difference. And these people buy this crap. And I don't understand it, but it's there. And I think a critique of those of us on the left is that we haven't found ways to break through that.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Kim Scipes. He's a professor and also author of many books about the role of the AFL-CIO and US labor internationally and the struggle of workers around the world. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek, Kim.
You're welcome, Steve. I hope it's been worthwhile.